Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. As promised, we're going to do something different today. We did the poetry section, the last of the poetry section in the last class, and today we're going to be doing something different. The story is titled Barn Burning, and it is by William Faulkner. I'm not going to recap what we did in the last lecture for the simple reason that that is over and done with. We did poetry and we did poems by quite a few famous poets, and I tried to give you an idea of the concerns and issues that American poets have discussed. Now we are on to William Faulkner, because as I told you at the very beginning of the module, I'm going to try to give you as broad a view of American literature as possible. Working through the ages, we come to the 20th century. And in the 20th century, you find out that William Faulkner is one of the most important names in American literature. Faulkner has written novels, and he's also written short stories. The one that we're doing today is titled Barn Burning, and there are references to the situation of the time. Faulkner, you know, wrote about the war, and he also wrote about the southern states. In particular, he was concerned with the way in which southern families had deteriorated and degenerated. One of the reasons that that is stated as being a prime cause of this degeneration and deterioration was the fact that families in the South married into each other so many times that their genes deteriorated. You know, just as we have people telling us also that you shouldn't have cousin marriages because genes deteriorate and you have certain diseases that come down through the families. In the same way, in the southern states, it was believed that if you had land, you could only marry people who had land. So the result was that these families, there were very few of these families who owned property, and they owned huge tracts of land. Because they only married into families who had similar property or who had adjoining properties, therefore it was like cousins marrying each other again and again. So one of the most important issues that Faulkner talks about is that. He also talks about how the agrarian society of the South represented the mindset of the people, and vice versa. So that there were people who were working on these plantations and who had absolutely no money, and then there were people who had plantations and who were filthy rich. So there were two sections of society, and the difference between these two sections was the difference between the sky and the earth, for example. The rich were very, very rich, and they continued to grow richer. The poor continued to grow poorer and poorer. This particular story of barn burning, the title refers to something different, and that is the issue of certain white people in the southern states who believed that white people or the Caucasian race was the superior race, and all other colors had to give it due respect. In particular, there was one group of white men who were known as the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. That's KU Ku, KLUX Klux, and KLAN Klan. And these people would go around wearing white sheets, and so that they could not be identified, and they would burn houses of people who considered the African Americans to be equal to them, or who showed in any way some sympathy with the African Americans. So barn burning was something that was very typical for them, because a barn, you have to understand, is a place where you store hay for the animals. And because most of the buildings were made of wood, it was very easy for those houses to burn. It still is, you know. In the United States, the majority of buildings are what you call frame buildings, where you would have the load-bearing walls, but inside the house, all partitions would be made of wood. So a place like that would, you know, if a fire broke out, it would go like this. So that's one of the situations in which barn burning was very common. And barn burning was very common as a means of punishing someone, particularly if you wanted revenge, because it was something that could be accomplished very easily. Because there was hay inside the barn and the building was made of wood, the best way of punishing someone or of getting revenge would be to go at night and burn down the barn. The owners would not realize what had happened until the barn caught fire, and then because there was no resources, there was no firefighting equipment. If a building caught fire, it just burned down. You know, there was no way you could put out the fire, particularly if it happened to be a barn. Now, one of the specialities of William Faulkner is the style in which he writes, and this style is conversational. And it's not just conversational, but he writes the language of the people that he is talking about, so that he doesn't try to modulate their phrases or even their thoughts. He writes it the way they speak. So when you are reading this text, you have to be very careful of how it is to be read and how it is to be interpreted. Okay, so let's get on with barn burning and see what William Faulkner has to say. The store in which the justice of the peace's court was sitting smelled of cheese. Now here again, Faulkner at once plunges you into the action, and the action takes place in a store. Now he's talking about a justice of the peace. This is a court of law, a court of the justice, but it is sitting in a store. You didn't have proper, let's say, court buildings in those days, so the court would convene in the biggest store. Depending on what was being discussed, benches would be placed there, and people would sit on the benches, or they would just stand and see what was being done. And this court of the justice of the peace was assembled periodically. Sometimes there was a justice of the peace for one area, and he would travel to different communities. For example, you have a justice of the peace for one city. So if it is a city like Rawalpindi, for example, then the justice of the peace would sit one day in Committee Chowk, another day in Sadar, another day in perhaps Satellite Town. So there would be a gap of time in the different courts that were assembled. So if it is Monday for Committee Chowk, it might be Tuesday for let's say Mareed Chowk, and so it would be only after a week or a month that this court would be assembled. So because it's a store, you know, it's a shop, therefore it smells of cheese. The boy crouched on his nail keg at the back of the crowded room knew he smelled cheese and more. From where he sat, he could see the ranked shelves close packed with the solid, squat, dynamic shapes of tin cans whose labels his stomach read, not from the lettering which meant nothing to his mind, but from the scarlet devils and the silver curve of fish. So he's a very small boy, and as he sits there, he looks at these cans on the shelves. Remember, it's a store that the court is assembling in. And he couldn't read, but he could see the pictures on those tin cans. So he knew that he knew the contents of the cans. And of course he smelled the cheese. So whatever was on display in the storehouse, he could smell it. And also because he was sitting idle, there was nothing that he could do. So he just sits there and he looks around, and Faulkner says that he smelled cheese and he felt fear, because mostly of despair and grief, the old fears pull of blood. So the fear is for his father. He could not see the table where the justice sat and before which his father and his father's enemy, and you know, because he's a small boy, he thinks it, you know, is our enemy, not just my father's enemy, but our enemy. So he couldn't see the table where the justice was sitting because, you know, he's a small boy. And because his father hadn't said anything yet, so he couldn't see his father. He knew where his father was, he knew where the justice of peace was, but he couldn't see all of them. So the court convenes, and the justice says, "What proof have you, Mr. Harris?" And Mr. Harris says, "I told you the hog got into my corn, I caught it up and set it back to him." So the fight is over a pig and a barn burning. So a pig and barn burning, and Mr. Harris says that the pig got into my cornfield, so I caught the pig and I sent it back to him. But you know, he couldn't control the pig, so the next time it came in, I put it in my pen, you know, where I have my animals on the farm. And when he came to get it, I told him that, you know, you have to pay a fee because I have been keeping your pig. And because he could not really control that animal, when it happened the third time, I didn't give it back to him. So the issue at hand is that there is a pig that goes into the neighboring farm and which is not returned, and the farmer, that is Mr. Harris, accuses the pig owner of burning down his farm. So when the third time the hog comes into his cornfield, and you know, hogs are very destructive creatures. It's not just that he was wandering into his farm, but they spoil the crop. They just trample on the corn or whatever is growing, and so they have to be controlled. So he says, when the third time it happened, I rode down to his horse. When he came to get the hog, I gave him a roll of wire so that he could make arrangements for the pen so that the hog would not escape. And then the same thing happened. And he says, when the next time it happened, I went down to his house and I saw that he had not even used that wire, although I had given it to him. So, this is the argument or the case that has been made. He said that Mr. Harris says that I told him that you could have the hog when you paid me $1. Now, obviously, he's so poor, he's working on somebody else's farm, so he doesn't have $1. But because the pig is worth more than $1, so he sends a nigger, as Faulkner calls him, or an African American, to go and get it. He pays him the $1 fee or fine, whatever way you look at it, and he brings the pig back. But he says, I have not seen that black man before. Although the black man or the African American paid him that £1, there was a message that he gave as he was paying the fine, and he says the message is, wood and hay can burn. And Mr. Harris says, that night my barn burned. I got the stock out, I got the animals out, but I lost the barn. See what I told you at the very beginning? A barn is the easiest place to burn down because it's made of wood and because there's hay stored inside. Now, the barn is also a place where you keep the animals, and if you have chicken, then you keep them there also. So it's a multi-purpose building. So Mr. Harris says that when my barn burned the same night, the first thought that came into my mind is, it's that person. There's nobody else who can do it. His nigger even warned me. So he took the animals out. The animals were saved, but of course the hay burned, the barn building burned, and there was a lot of, there was a huge loss that the farmer had to bear. So because a case like this cannot be decided without witnesses, the Justice of the Peace asks Mr. Harris if he can produce the nigger, and he says, no, I'm telling you that it was a strange nigger and I don't know where he is now. So the judge says, well, there's no proof, we can't do anything, it's just your word against his. So how can I believe you when you cannot even produce a witness? And all of a sudden Mr. Harris, sees this little boy sitting there, and he says, get that boy up here, he knows. And for a moment, this little boy, who is the protagonist of our story, he thinks that they are talking about his elder brother because he's so small. But Harris says, not the older brother, the little one, the boy. And so he was pulled up and brought before the justice. Now, this was a very scary experience for the little boy, and he says that I just saw all those men who had assembled to witness or to see what was being done in the way of justice. They all just separated, and a path opened up before him for him to pass through. So then he says that I saw the Justice of the Peace, whom Faulkner describes through the eyes of the little boy. And he says that he was a shabby, collarless, greying man in spectacles. So not a very impressive justice of the peace. So the little boy, he is told to go before the justice of the peace so that he can be questioned by Mr. Harris. He felt no floor beneath his bare feet. So he's a poor boy, so he is not wearing shoes. He seemed to walk beneath the palpable weight of the grim turning faces. So obviously, you know, his father is the accused, and therefore everybody is sort of looking down at him. And when they say, okay, bring this boy up to the front, everybody turns around, and you know, they have these very strict looks on their faces. His father, of course, is dressed in his Sunday best, not because he was coming to the court, but because they were moving from that area. So the little boy thinks that the father is hoping that he will tell a lie, and I'll have to tell a lie. You know, it's a very confusing state of mind for a little boy, whether to support his father or to tell a lie. So the justice says, "What's your name, boy?" And he says, "Colonel Sartoris Snopes." And because he's so scared of the justice of the peace, he just whispers his name. And the justice says, "Hey, talk louder. Colonel Sartoris? I reckon anybody named for Colonel Sartoris in this country can't help but tell the truth, can they?" Now here there's a reference to Colonel Sartoris, who was somewhat of a hero in the southern states. And so when the justice of the peace hears that the little boy is named after Colonel Sartoris, he says, you know, he was a great hero, so you can't help but speak the truth, so it's a good thing, we will have you as witness. The boy said nothing, but the idea that came to his mind is that, you know, this is the enemy, and this is the person who has brought my father to this. We're supposed to be moving, and he has accused my father of burning down the barn. And he was very, very confused, and so then the justice says, "Do you want me to question this boy?" And the little boy is scared because, you know, he doesn't know what to do. There's his father, and then there's the justice of the peace. And it's almost as if, you know, he is in a very, very dangerous situation. He's got to be very careful of what he says and how he says it. So, you know, the boy is in a condition of is in a confused state of mind because he doesn't know what to do. And Harris says no. When the justice of the peace says, "Do you want me to question the boy?" And he says, "No, send him out of here." Because he realizes that the boy is very small. And of course the boy, you know, feels relieved. It's as if he has been saved from the hangman's noose. And when Mr. Harris says that he doesn't want to question the boy, the justice then says the case is closed. I can't find against you, Snopes, but I can give you advice. Leave this country and don't come back to it. So the judge says that although Mr. Snopes is free, yet he says, you know, it would be a good idea for you to leave this place because it's a very small community, and in a small community, if two people have very strong feelings against each other, then it is better that they separate and not live in the small place. So the justice of the peace gives a very sort of fair verdict because Harris doesn't have proof and yet he accuses Mr. Snopes of having burned down his barn. It's a very serious accusation because it has meant a big loss for Mr. Harris. But when it comes to questioning the little boy, he just says, okay, forget about it. Now the Justice of the Peace is convinced that Snopes did burn down the barn, but because it's a court of justice, they cannot proceed as they want to. There's a procedure for it and they have to stick to that. So he says, you know, I don't have proof against you, Mr. Snopes, but because of this tension between you and Mr. Harris, it would be the best thing if you were to leave this place immediately. And the father says, I aim to. I don't figure to stay in a country among people who, and here Faulkner leaves dots because he's using abusive language. He doesn't want to live with people who are who have such, as he says, dirty minds, or who have such low characters. And of course the justice becomes very angry at that. You know, you're not supposed to curse or use abusive language before a justice of the peace. And if you do, you can be fined for it. You can even be imprisoned for it. So the justice gets very angry and he says, that will do. Take your wagon and get out of this country before dark. Case dismissed. So he's very angry with Mr. Snopes, not just because he is accused of having burned down a barn, but also because Mr. Snopes is a very rude man and he used insulting language in front of the judge. And that is why the judge says, you know, get lost, get out of this place, don't show me your face again, and you need to get out of here as soon as possible. And then he dismisses the case because there's no evidence against him. The father turns and he, you know, because he's a little boy, all that he sees is that black coat and his father walking ahead of him. So he just follows his father. And here Faulkner brings in his descriptive powers by pointing to a slight limp in Snopes's walk. And he gives a sort of historical background also when he says that Mr. Snopes limped because he had been injured. He had been injured during the war, and he still had a musket ball, or the equivalent of a bullet, in the heel of his foot. So the little boy just walks behind his father and he notices that his father is limping because of this bullet that he has in his heel. And as they are leaving the court, they hear someone just whispering, "Barn burner." So like I said, it was a very serious offense, and a person who has burned one barn will not be allowed to stay in that vicinity, because all the other people will feel afraid of him, will feel that they lack confidence in their dealings with him, because the moment that he gets angry, he might start burning other people's barns also. So he follows his father, and when his father says, "Go get in the wagon," he just climbs the wagon, which stands in a grove of locusts and mulberries across the road. Now this is the wagon. This is not the wagon that we have these days, by the way. This is a horse-drawn carriage, but not a fancy kind. This was the kind that was covered. I don't know if you have seen photographs of a tonga. We used to have tongas once upon a time, and this is about, what, 40 years ago. Now, of course, they've been banned in most places, but a tonga is like a wagon. The difference is that the wagon could be covered on all sides, so that it almost made a sort of a room. There was place to sit up front with the driver, and then there would be a couple of chairs in the covered portion also, so that if it started raining or if the sun was too strong for you, you could sort of hide inside that place and not get wet. So when he goes towards the wagon, his two sisters are already there, and they also have their best clothes, their Sunday dresses, because moving day is very special. When you're going on the road, people see you. Work clothes are different. You are expected to wear work clothes and not wear fancy clothes in which you will not be able to work. So Faulkner describes the appearance of the little boy's sisters, and he pays particular attention to the fact that the sisters were strong physically but did not want to do any of the work. So he calls them bovine sisters, the two hulking sisters. You know, nothing positive can be said about these sisters. There's also Sartorus's wife and her sister. So the whole family is moving together. So, you know, all that they owned could fit into that wagon. And that gives you an idea of how poor they were. They had very few utensils or pieces of furniture, and because they kept on moving from one place to another, they could not have a lot of furniture. They couldn't afford it, and they could not have furniture because what Snopes is doing here is what was called sharecropping. You know, poor white men could do sharecropping, and in that what they did was that they would sort of lease or rent somebody's land, and in return for growing food on that land, they would pay the owner not cash but in kind, so that you got something from the field. You got enough to eat, to maintain a living and a family, and the owner, without doing any work, would get a certain amount of, let's say, wheat or corn or something else. Whatever was being grown, the major portion went to the person who owned the land. So the major portion went to the person who owned the land, and the sharecropper, in this case Mr. Snopes, would get only sufficient to feed his family. So only the very poor would do that. They worked from dawn to dusk, they worked at night also, and yet at the end of the day what they got was only enough grain for their basic needs. Now, Mr. Snopes was a sharecropper, and sharecropping was done in such a way that you could either stay in the same place for a few years, or if you didn't like the owner of the land or the owner didn't like you, then the agreement would come to an end after the expiry of that period. So if it is, let's say, 8 months or 9 months, and 8 months was normal, if for 8 months you were a sharecropper on somebody's plantation or somebody's land, and at the end of 8 months you did not like the owner or the owner didn't like you, then the agreement would come to an end, and the sharecropper would have to move somewhere else. Now that involved a lot of travel, and it also involved a lot of effort. But Mr. Snopes is presented as the kind of person who doesn't get along with anyone. He's hard. He's very, very hard, even for his boy, even for his own children, his wife, his sister-in-law. He's very, very hard. So he doesn't get along with the owners of the farm. So every 8 months, you know, they have to move. And that's what they're doing now. And Faulkner gives us a sort of a picture of their life when he describes the contents of the wagon. He says that there was a battered stove, there were broken beds and chairs, and then there was this clock inlaid with mother of pearl, which was all the dowry that his mother had. And this clock was not working. You know, it was a showpiece. It was there for decoration purposes only, because the clock had broken and it didn't work anymore. You know, that's about all that they had. So with this load, they would move every 8 months. Now when the boy gets to the wagon, he sees that his mother is crying, and you know, she wants to hold him close because he's just a little boy, and the father, because he's very hard and very harsh, and he wants to discipline both the boy and the mother. So he says, "Get back." She says, "You know, he's hurt. I want to get some water and maybe wash his face." And the father is very strict, and he says, "Get back in the wagon." So he will not allow the mother even to wash her son's face. He also climbs in, and you know, he starts the wagon. Now there are the wagon is being pulled by giant mules. Like I told you before, this is not the kind of wagon that you have out in the roads and in which you go from your house to the university or from your house to a shopping place, etc., etc. So you have these 2 mules who are pulling the wagon. And the poverty of the Snopes family can be seen in the fact that even the mules, which are very, very strong physically, are gaunt. You know, they are very bony animals. They don't have a lot of flesh because they don't get sufficient food. So Mr. Snopes just flicks them with the whip so that they will start moving, and they do start moving. The wagon went on. So they continue, or they start their journey with the store, with its quiet crowd of grimly watching men dropped behind. A curve in the road hid it. So all these people are convinced that Mr. Snopes burnt the Harris's barn, but there's no way they can prove it. So they're all sort of against Snopes and in favor of Harris, because Harris is a local. Harris is not coming from another city or another village. And because these are very small communities, Mr. Harris belonged to that community, and so that community of men, it stood with Mr. Harris. And Mr. Snopes was on his own. So when this little boy looks back, he sees that people are still watching them until they go round a curve, and finally the store and all the people around it and the people who are coming out of it are hidden from their view. And the boy thinks, you know, this is the last time that I want to see these people. And he's feeling very angry. You know, what you see here is conflicting emotions. The little boy is little, but he wants to be big. He wants to act big, and he wants to do whatever it is that big folks do. So when he feels that his father has been discriminated against, he gets very angry, and his thoughts run something like, you know, maybe he's done satisfied now that he has, and then he has to stop himself not to say anything out loud because he's very scared of his father. So he feels very sort of emotionally attached to his father, and it's like, you know, they're men and they should be, and he should also feel strong. So when his mother says, does it hurt? And you notice that Faulkner uses the H sound, does it hurt? And he says, no, it don't hurt, let me be. So this little boy, because he wants to be considered a grown-up, doesn't want to be, you know, doesn't want to be made to feel that he's a little boy. He wants to be a man, so he tells his mother, you know, it doesn't hurt. And the mother says, can't you wipe some of the blood off before it dries? And he says, oh, I'll wash tonight. Let me be, I tell you. You know, acting like a grown-up, just like you see some young men, you tell them, oh, you wash your face and you must comb your hair. And they'll say, oh, men don't care, men don't comb their hair, it's women who do it. Although I do notice that men these days appear to take a lot of care of their appearance. Yet when you're growing up, you do not want to be treated like a little boy. There comes a certain age when you just maybe 8 or 9, and you're going to go into the age of puberty or adolescence, and you feel like a man, but you look like a little boy, and because you want to be treated like a man, so there's that confusion in the mind. And the same is true of this little boy who's been named after a Confederate hero. So this boy is named Colonel Sartorius Snopes. Snopes is his father's name, and he's been named after a Confederate war hero. So he wants to feel like a man, especially with a name like that. And so he says, you know, you stay away and I'll wash it tonight. Now, he has blood on his face, but because he doesn't want to be made to feel like a child, he tells his mother to stay away and not to try to wipe off the blood. The mother feels very strongly because, after all, he is her baby, but he's at the age where he doesn't want to be treated like a baby. So, you know, they travel on. The next farm where they are supposed to share crop is 3 days away. And so they travel onwards, and none of them, the important thing is, none of them knows where they are going. And they're not even bothered, because these are arrangements that the father makes, that Mr. Snopes makes, and he doesn't share them with anyone. He doesn't even ask anyone's opinion. He just makes the arrangement and tells his family that such and such a date they have to move, and so they have no choice in the matter. The father, Mr. Snopes, Faulkner says, had a wolf-like independence and courage. So he is, the picture that is painted of Snopes is like that of a lonely wolf, a wolf who operates on his own, and yet who can hunt. So they continue with their journey, and you see that the only person who knows where they are going is the father. The elder son doesn't know, the wife doesn't know, the wife's sister, and of course his daughters do not count. So you see that the picture that Faulkner is presenting is that of one which is a strictly patriarchal society. The man is the head of the household. He makes the decisions. The women do the work, but they do not have any role to play in making decisions, so that when they move from one farm to another, the women don't know where they're going. All that they know is they're moving. They have to pick up everything from the house, put it in the wagon, load the wagon, and when they get to their destination, they just have to make sure that they take all the stuff out, put it in the new house. And with a person like Snopes, who is sort of always getting into arguments, he has to have a new farm after every 8 months. He doesn't stay in one place because he doesn't like to, and because the people who own the land realize that he's always looking for quarrels. So they travel on, and throughout the night and throughout the day, the boy keeps on thinking of that incident, and he keeps on thinking of how people looked at him. So with that sort of association with his father, he starts hating all those people. He doesn't realize that his father is responsible for that barn burning, but it's just that the competition or the contest is between his father and another man. So the another man has to lose out. His father is the best. So there's that very fierce sense of loyalty that this little boy has. And here Faulkner sort of makes an aside. He gives a sort of story, a part of the story which happens at an earlier age. And when they are camping at night, Faulkner refers to the fact that the farmer, or Mr. Snopes, he makes a small fire. And Faulkner tries to go into the history of that fire, and he says that, you know, this is the kind of fire that he made during the war, because during the war they had to be very careful of where they were and how easily they could be found. And so when they wanted to heat their food, or when they wanted a little light, they would make a very small fire. Faulkner calls it a niggard blaze, a very, very small fire, because a small fire cannot be seen from far. A small fire is easy to put out. A small fire is not dangerous in a place where you would have, let's say, a lot of dry wood. So he makes a small fire, and this is the sort of Faulkner's viewpoint of Mr. Snopes. So the little boy had seen huge fires, but he had also seen these tiny, or what Faulkner calls niggard blazes, or niggard fires, a lot of times, because whenever they were traveling, his father would make sure that they had a fire, but it would be a very small fire. Now, while they are sitting around the fire eating, he feels sleepy, and at once Mr. Snopes calls out to him. And what you see here is the fact that Mr. Snopes cannot be questioned. You know, he's very much that patriarch, very much the person in command. So when he calls to someone, that person responds. If he says, don't do this, nobody will dare defy him, because he's a very hard man. So when the little boy is almost falling asleep on his plate, his father calls him, and he has no choice but to follow the stiff back, the stiff and ruthless limp, up the slope and on to the starlit road, where turning he could see his father against the stars, but without face or depth, as though cut from tin in the iron folds of the frock coat, which had not been made for him. The voice harsh like tin and without heat like tin. So the little boy starts to follow his father. He doesn't know where the father is going. He doesn't know how long they are going to be walking, but the father says, "Follow me," and he has to do it. He has no choice in the matter. He cannot even ask where they are going. And so he follows his father. And the one comment that he makes is on his appearance. He says that, when he turns around, it's as if he's made of tin and not flesh and blood. Now, when the father takes him away to the side, he says, "You were fixing to tell them. You would have told him." So this little boy was the only witness to the barn burning. And the father takes him aside and he says, "You were going to tell the justice of the peace that I had burned the barn." And the little boy has nothing to say, because yes, he had been planning to tell them, when he's told that he must speak the truth. That's what he plans to do, but he doesn't realize that this is going to mean that his father is going to beat him up. So his father just utters these two sentences, and when the little boy doesn't respond, he just hits him with the flat of his head on the side of the head. And the little boy says that he was hit hard but without heat. The father was not angry with him. There's a difference between being hit when the hitter is angry and when the hitter is hitting without any anger. This is something that the father does because he wants to discipline the boy. He doesn't want the boy telling any stories to anyone, particularly not to the lawmakers or the justices or the judges. So he just says, you were going to tell him, and then he gives him one, and the boy takes it. He just can't do anything. And the father says, "You're getting to be a man. You got to learn. You got to learn to stick to your own blood, or you ain't gonna have any blood to stick to you." So this is where the little boy learns his lesson. And the father just hits him on the side of the head, and then he says, "You have to learn. You have to learn that where your family is concerned, your family comes first. Truth is an abstraction. It comes much later. You have to defend your family. You have to protect your family, or you will not have a family, because if you had told the judge that I burned the barn, I would have been taken away. I would have been punished, and you would have been left without a father." So he says you've got to be very careful about things like that. And while he's doing that, he says, "Do you think either of them, any man there this morning would? Don't you know all they wanted was a chance to get at me because they knew I had them beat?" So because he's been working very hard on the farm, he says that, the other people who were watching, they would have made fun of me. They would have been convinced that I was no good, because there's a lot of resentment in that village, in that town, against Mr. Snopes. The townspeople would have been very excited to see him punished or to see him paying for what he has done. So there was a lot of jealousy involved there. And so he says, you know, you can't do that. Where family is concerned, you have to stick together. And not ruin your family just because you feel that you have to speak the truth. And he says, if I had said they wanted only truth, justice, he would have hit me again. So the little boy, you know, once he is hit, all thoughts of confiding in the justice of the peace or telling him the truth, they just go out of his head. And he doesn't even think of defying his father and saying that the justice of the peace wanted only the truth and you should have let me do it. He doesn't just sort of accept this idea at all. For him, what is most important is that blood should stick to blood. So when the father says, you're not going to do that again, are you? And he says, no, I will not. I will take care of my family and I will not let my family down. So then the father says, get on to bed. We'll be there tomorrow. So this is the night before they reach this place. We're going to stop here, but I want to recap quickly before we break off. And where we do stop is the point at which they are just one night away from their final destination. The story is titled Barn Burning, and William Faulkner is writing about what are known as the southern states or the Confederacy. You know that there was civil war in America, or what the people like to call the war between the states, in which some of the states broke away from the Federation and they said that we're going to set up our own government and we don't recognize the government of the Union. And these states were known as the Confederate states. Now, the background to the story is definitely an agricultural background, because the barn is a place where farmers keep the hay, and not only do they keep the hay, but they also keep the farm animals there. And so when the story starts, we are told that there is a court of law which has been constituted, and it is being conducted in one of the stores because there's a lot of room there, and this little boy is at the back of the store watching what is going on, because his father is the accused and Mr. Harris is the plaintiff or the accuser. And his father is accused of having burned down Mr. Harris's barn, and Mr. Harris presents his argument and he says, you know, Mr. Snopes has a hog who would come into my cornfield, and when I told him to control his hog, I was given a message that wood and hay can burn. And he says that the same day that I received this message through a Negro, my barn burned, and I know that this is the doing of Mr. Snopes. So the judge says, do you have a witness? Can you produce that Negro? And he says, no, it was a strange Negro. I can't produce any witnesses, but this little boy was there. This little boy will tell the truth, so please call him up and ask him. Now, when this boy is asked to the front of the store, he thinks that he's going to tell them the truth. But then Mr. Harris, you know, has other thoughts, and he says, okay, forget about it. Now, the judge is convinced that it is Mr. Snopes who burned the store. but because there are no witnesses, he says, I cannot pass the sentence, but I want you to leave this area immediately and not come back to it. So then Mr. Snope says, well, I'm leaving anyway, because you then see his family already packed up and sitting in the wagon waiting for the father and sons to come so that they can move on to their new home. And it is while they are moving or traveling towards their new home that they stop on the way, because they're not traveling at night. So when they stop, the father takes this little boy on the side and he says, you know, you were going to tell the justice of the peace and other people that I burned down the barn. And while saying this, he just snaps him on the side of his head and he says, remember, you are not to say anything against your family. Your family are your blood. And if you say anything that harms the family, then very fast you will find that you have no family. Your family members are going to be taken away one by one, and very soon you will be on your own. So this is the point at which we end, because this is where the father says that you have to be very careful that you stand with your family, and if you don't stand with your family will not stand with you. As he says, you got to take care of your blood, otherwise you will have no blood to take care of you. So this is the point at which we are ending the story. We're going to do the rest of it, inshallah, in the next lecture. Thank you very much, and Allah Hafiz.